Let's begin with Anthony Albanese, who has dismissed warnings by US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth to raise Australia's defence spending to 3% of the GDP. Hegseth met with Defence Minister Richard Marles at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore last week to discuss defence spending. The Defence Minister seemed open to the idea as he spoke about Australia's generational investment into defence during the summit.
Australia is investing in a generational transformation of the ADF to ensure we are not only in a position to deter force projection against us, but also to contribute to an effective regional balance where no state concludes that force is a viable way to achieve strategic goals.
And speaking to the ABC later, the minister also said he was open to that conversation. But the Prime Minister then rebuffed the US administration's intervention, saying Labor will stick to increasing the defence spending to just over 2% of GDP by 2033. Here's Anthony Albanese on that.
What we'll do is we'll determine our defence policy, and we've invested just across the forwards an additional $10 billion in defence.
Kel, what do you think of the government ignoring the US advice here?
Well, I suppose the good news is that when the Chinese take over, they'll find student debt is very low because the Albanese spent the money paying off student debt, cancelling student debt that needed to go into... It's just absurd to say the Americans are not going to tell us what to do. They've got bases here, and we're actually assuming that if we get attacked, they'll come to our rescue, but we're not interested in what they say. It's just nonsense. One of the commercial newses I made the mistake of looking at claimed that the Americans want us to spend 5% of GDP. They don't. They're asking the Europeans to spend 5% of GDP and us to spend 3% of GDP, which is not a big ask. They're actually already allowing for our needs. And if we think that we don't need to do that when there have been Chinese ships sailing around Australia in live firing exercises, carefully mapping where our undersea cables are so they can at least partially cut us off from the rest of the world when the bombs started going off, we're just absurd. When I looked at this, I thought, Albanese is just blind about some things. He was blind about the voice. He couldn't see that it was looking in the wrong direction, and he can't see that this is looking in the wrong direction. Of course you listen to the Americans. Of course you keep them happy. And our Defence Force is seriously undermanned. Its job is to fight wars. They are to be a lethal force. They either go out as a lethal force or they die. That's what being in the Defence Force is, and they're not being given the equipment they need.
Well, Lucy, Hegseth spoke specifically about that threat from China that Kel's talking about in his address. And the fact is that Albanese is going to be meeting with his US counterpart, Donald Trump, in just a couple of weeks. He's going to be asking for relief on the tariffs, increased tariffs.
Which he's not going to get.
And a commitment to AUKUS. But if they can't give anything in return in terms of defence spending, how do you think that will go?
Well, it's not going to go well. And to Kel's point, of course, you know, when we talk about these Chinese warships that were circumnavigating the east coast of Australia, that were only 150 nautical miles, right, off Sydney. And to give you an indication, that's literally like from Sydney to Canberra. So the fact that they weren't distressed by the presence of these ships at the time, which was evident in how Albanese handled it, I think that was the first red flag for me. The fact that they're remaining so staunch in their desire to avoid furthering spending of our defence budget and getting it closer to that 3% of GDP is also another really big worry. You know, for all of these musings from the Albanese government, I don't think that they will have any sway when it comes to tariffs and then when it comes to this position also. And with respect to AUKUS as well, we have to remember the fact that this isn't going to really start to take into effect for Australia until the 2030s. So we are still some ways off from being able to bolster our defence. And if it doesn't come in the form of raising it to 3% of GDP, where does it come from? Do we just continue to allow these Chinese ships to circumnavigate our shores? Do we just sit back like sitting ducks and wait for something to happen? I mean, we're so busy throwing money at ideological things like climate change and, you know, free childcare for 3 days and university and all of this stuff. What about protecting our country and our sovereign borders? Where does that factor into all of this?
And you'd think that would be the government's #1 job.